You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail, and it includes 4 different sites showcasing sunken historic boats.
You can now walk into Lake Tahoe and find yourself standing above a shipwreck. That is not a metaphor. California state parks recently opened Tahoe's first underwater trail, a series of buoyed sites in Emerald Bay where snorkelers and kayakers can look straight down through some of the clearest water in North America and see sunken vessels resting on the bottom, exactly where they went down decades ago. It sounds almost too calm to be the opening of a scary story. But the reason that trail exists at all, the reason anyone can see those wrecks so clearly, is a drought that pulled Lake Tahoe's waterline down further and faster than almost anyone alive has seen. And what that drought exposed, both along the shore and far below it, is not a legend invented for clicks. It is a real, documented, ongoing story about what 15 million visitors a year leave behind in the most photographed lake in America. Start with the numbers, because they are dramatic enough on their own. The years leading up to 2024 brought what climate scientists at the Central Sierra Snow Lab have called the driest extended stretch in roughly 1,200 years across the wider region. Snowpack that normally feeds Tahoe's tributaries through the spring and summer thinned out. Evaporation outpaced inflow. And because Tahoe is so enormous, holding enough water to cover the entire state of California over a foot deep, its level does not swing wildly the way a small reservoir does. When Tahoe drops, it drops slowly, which is exactly why a multi-year drought was able to pull the lake down below its natural rim, the elevation at which water stops flowing out into the Truckee River at all. That has happened before in the modern record, in the early 1990s and again in the 2010s. But the 2024 drought pushed the shoreline back further than most residents now living had ever personally seen, and it stayed that way long enough for things buried for half a century to see daylight again. What emerged first was ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of debris you expect around any heavily used recreational lake. Old bottles, fishing gear, sunglasses, boat parts corroded past recognition. Locals walking newly exposed beach found tires and cans that had clearly been sitting underwater for a very long time. It would have been easy to write all of it off as litter and move on. But Tahoe already had an organization built specifically to take that kind of debris seriously, and their work is where the real story actually begins. In 2020, a diver named Colin West started noticing just how much trash was sitting on the lakebed near shore, and what began as informal survey dives turned into a nonprofit called Clean Up the Lake. Over the following year, West and a rotating crew of volunteer scuba divers systematically covered the entire 72-mile shoreline of Lake Tahoe, diving to depths of about 25 feet, GPS tagging every piece of debris they found. It took 81 dive days spread across more than a year, using over 600 tanks of air and more than 6,000 volunteer hours. By the time they surfaced on the final dive near Edgewood, Tahoe, in the spring of 2022, they had pulled out close to 25,000 pounds of litter, over 24,000 individual pieces, each one logged, sorted, and categorized. Most of it was exactly what you expect: bottles, cans, fishing line, boat debris, construction scraps. But not all of it. Divers reported finding a diamond ring somewhere along the bottom, the kind of small human tragedy that never makes headlines but sticks with the person who found it, near Dead Man's Point on the lake's east shore, close to where local legend places a lair of Tahoe's own Lake Monster myth, Tahoe Tessie. Divers spotted wooden planks consistent with shipwreck, a reminder that Tahoe has been ferrying people and cargo since well before it was a tourist destination. And running through nearly every dive log was a quieter, more troubling pattern. Cans and bottles unmistakably from the 1960s and 1970s, sitting on the bottom exactly where they landed, barely touched by decades underwater. That preservation is not an accident. It is chemistry. Lake Tahoe sits at over 6,000 feet of elevation in a basin carved by geological faulting millions of years ago, and it plunges to roughly 1,645 feet at its deepest point, making it the second deepest lake in the United States after Oregon's Crater Lake. Its water rarely warms much above the low 40s even in summer, and because the surrounding granite basin contributes almost no nutrients to the water, very little grows or lives in the deep zones to break organic material down. Cold water slows decomposition. Low biological activity means fewer organisms doing the slow work of decay. The combination is why a soda can from the Nixon administration can come up looking freshly discarded, and it is also exactly why divers keep finding things that anywhere else would have rusted into dust generations ago. That preservation effect is precisely what makes Tahoe's next chapter worth taking seriously, because the divers were not finished. In 2020, cleaning up the lake had only been working in the shallow zone, roughly the top 25 feet. Starting in 2024 and running through 2025, the organization launched what they called a deep dive pilot project, pushing operations down a depth of 35 to 55 feet, in partnership with regional research groups and using new equipment, including diver propulsion vehicles and nitrox gear, needed to work safely that far down at Tahoe's high altitude. Between February and July of 2025 alone, over 6 months of survey work across just over 10 combined miles of lakebed and shoreline in Placer County, divers pulled out nearly 2,000 pounds of debris, more than 1,000 individual items, including 248 glass bottles and 21 anchors. Based on that concentration, the team estimated that if similar amount of debris exists at comparable depths around the entire lake, there could be close to 30,000 additional pounds and 17,000 more items still sitting down there, waiting to be mapped. By December 2025, Clean Up the Lake had launched what Colin West called a second lap, a full-scale, multi-year push to extend the deep clean across the entire 72-mile shoreline at those 35 to 55-foot depths. West has described it as something the team used to joke about years ago, half hoping it would never actually be necessary. It turned out to be necessary. For years of research, 60 separate deep dive surveys, and a pilot program done in partnership with the North Tahoe Community Alliance all pointed to the same conclusion. The shallow cleanup everyone celebrated in 2022 had only ever addressed the top layer of a much larger, much deeper problem. None of this, it is worth being clear, is about barrels of industrial waste or bodies preserved in the deep basin. Those are the kind of claims that circulate constantly about Lake Tahoe, partly because the lake genuinely does have a colorful and sometimes dark history. During the mid-20th century, when casinos opened on the Nevada side and the post-war boom brought a wave of hotels, resorts, and construction to the basin, environmental regulation genuinely was minimal by today's standards, and organized crime genuinely did have a documented presence around the casino industry, including the well-known scandal that cost Frank Sinatra his gaming license at the Calneva Lodge in the 1960s over his association with mob figures. Those facts are real, and they are part of why local folklore about the lake runs as deep as the water itself. Cleanup organizers say it is one of the questions that get asked constantly by curious visitors. Have you found any gangsters down there? The honest answer, according to everyone actually doing the diving, is no. What the divers keep finding instead is trash. Enormous amount of it, spanning 70 years of casual human carelessness, but ordinary litter and lost personal items rather than evidence of any conspiracy. The genuinely alarming part of the Tahoe story is not hidden barrels. It is something both more mundane and, in its own way, more unsettling, because it is happening in plain sight, and it is measured every single year. Since 1968, researchers at the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center have tracked the lake's water clarity using a simple method, lowering a white disk into the water and recording the depth at which it disappears from view. In the late 1960s, that disk was visible down to around 100 feet, a number that made Tahoe famous as one of the clearest large lakes on Earth. By 2019, that had fallen to around 80 feet. In 2024, researchers recorded some of the murkiest water on record, with a disk vanishing at just over 62 feet, only narrowly missing the all-time low set in 2017. Scientists studying the decline say it comes down to fine sediment and nutrient runoff washing into the lake from roads, construction, and stormwater, worsened by wildfire ash, drought-driven sediment buildup in tributary streams, and the kind of intense atmospheric river storms that flush all of it into the lake at once. Researchers at the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency have stated plainly that despite decades of restoration work and billions of dollars invested, the long-term clarity trend has essentially stalled rather than reversed. That is, the real, well-documented, scientifically verified version of Tahoe is not what it appears to be. No secret barrels required. There is also the matter of microplastics, which is arguably the closest thing Tahoe has to a genuinely invisible, slow-building threat. Researchers at the Desert Research Institute in Reno first documented microplastic particles in Tahoe's water back in 2019, and the debris hauled out by Clean Up the Lake's divers gives some indication of where much of it originates. Degrading boat parts, plastic bottles, synthetic fishing line, and construction debris breaking down slowly in cold water over years and decades. Scientists are still working out exactly how much harm these particles cause to the lake's ecosystem and to the people who swim, boat, and drink water drawn from it, but the fact that they are accumulating at all in a lake this pristine is itself the story, and it has won the divers, not any conspiracy theory, brought to public attention. So what actually happened as Lake Tahoe's water level dropped? A historic, multi-year drought pulled the shoreline back further than it had been in years, exposing decades of accumulated litter along newly bare beach. It also gave researchers and volunteer divers an opening to survey depths that had rarely, if ever, been systematically studied before, first in the shallow zone, and now increasingly in deeper water. What they found was not a hidden crime scene. It was a mirror, an unusually clear and unusually cold one, held up to 70 years of a lake being loved by millions of people who mostly never thought about where their trash actually ended up. Sunglasses. Soda cans still readable after 50 years underwater. A wedding ring somebody lost and never found. Wooden shipwreck planks resting where Tahoe folklore says a monster lives. 25,000 pounds of litter becoming closer to 60,000 pounds once the deeper surveys are finished. And a clarity measurement, tracked faithfully every year since 1968, quietly declining even as the postcards keep looking the same. The drought that exposed all of this was not permanent, and neither is the low water level. Snow years return. The Truckee River Basin has swung between drought and flood before, and it will again. Tahoe rose back toward full pool within a couple years of past dry spells, and the same recovery has already begun this time. When the water comes back up, the newly exposed beaches will disappear beneath the surface again, and most visitors will never think twice about what is resting on the bottom beneath their paddleboard. But the divers will keep going down there anyway, because the real discovery of the last few years was never a single terrifying object. It was a realization that an enormous amount of what humanity has quietly left behind in one of the most beautiful lakes on the continent has simply been sitting there the whole time, cold, dark, and perfectly preserved, waiting for someone to finally go looking. That is the actual story hiding beneath Lake Tahoe's postcard blue surface. Not a cover-up, but 70 years of ordinary human carelessness, kept almost perfectly intact by some of the coldest, clearest, most unforgiving water in North America. If that is the kind of quiet, real-world mystery that gets under your skin, the ongoing effort to map and clean the lake's deeper waters is still happening right now, and it is worth watching for what divers uncover next as the second lap of Tahoe's cleanup continues.